So I'm going to introduce Mary B. Marcy. She's president of Dominican University of California. She joined Dominican last year after serving as provost at Bard College at Simon's Rock and vice president at Bard College.
I'm thrilled to be doing this for a couple of reasons. One is that I love taking off my president's hat and actually talking about not only my research, but about what I think are some of the bigger issues in American politics and public policy. So it's a privilege for me to do this, and I wanted to particularly thank the League for sponsoring this talk and inviting me. Among other things that I have done in my past, I at one time ran some state senate campaigns back in my home state of Nebraska, and I worked very closely with the League of Women Voters in developing debates that we thought would be fair and equitable. Of course, I had a little bit of a blinder's view on that at the time, but what I found was the League was always fair-minded, and what I believe, and you will see this in some of my slides, is that most politics, as Tip O'Neill said, is not only local, but the way that we make change is often through our communities and our regions. And the League is one of those organizations that consistently across the country leads that kind of conversation and that kind of change. So it's a privilege for me to be here. I'm going to tell you a bit about how we'll do this presentation so that you feel free to jump in and not only, if you're like any other league I've ever met, you're not good at just listening. We wouldn't have a conversation. So this is not, let me tell you what it is not. It is not kind of cable news punditry about what the current election cycle is doing. You can get that in lots of other places, and political scientists are famous for being bad at predicting elections anyway. But what I hope I can do is provide some context for some of the conversations that are going on at the national level, and perhaps some background for some of the strategies that you see in the races. And we can think about some of those things together, because it's not always obvious what's happening. And I want to do that by looking at women in American politics in a few ways. So let me give you a quick overview. We're going to talk about the history. This obviously is a very quick cut at history, but I'll show you some of the patterns historically about where women have been elected to office. We'll talk more about women in elective office than about community organizing or the right to vote and so on. So this will be a quick overview so we can see some national trends. So let's start a little bit with the history of women in politics. I love maps. I love this map. And one of the things I like about it is that we tend to look at the United States in politics in a couple of ways. We tend to either look at us as a one big block, or we hear these segmentations, which usually means red states and blue states, right? This map has some different characteristics, and I want you to think about the map in your head of what we know the red states and blue states look like now, and where those states kind of align on the map. Because one of the interesting things about women in American politics is that it does not align with where women first were elected to office, and even where they're still successfully elected to office, doesn't necessarily align with Democrat, Republican, progressive, conservative, etc. So we're going to go back and come to the present. The first women elected to a state House of Representatives were in 1894 in Colorado. Remember when women, you all know this, my students don't. When did women get the vote? When did women secure the vote? This was way before when women secured the vote. Although in the West, as you likely know, many states had women's right to vote before the nation did. So 1894, Colorado elects women to the state House. 1896, Utah elects a woman to the state Senate. 1917, Montana elects a woman to the U.S. Congress before women have even secured the vote nationally. So does anybody know who this is?
Rankin.
Jeanette Rankin. Jeanette Rankin was elected to Congress. She was a Quaker and a pacifist. She voted against the war. They booted her out. Then she ran again in the late 20s, early 30s, was elected again. And then World War II came along, she voted against the war, and they booted her out again. Actually, a really interesting case study for women in politics on many levels. Okay, so those are all pre-women even securing the vote. Here's our outlier. So Georgia actually elected the first woman to the U.S. Senate. Georgia. So my wonderful dissertation advisor always used to say to me that the exception shouldn't prove the rule, it tests it. You have to be able to explain it. Why is it there? Why is it an outlier? Well, Georgia is not a place that you would consider progressive on these issues. And it wasn't then and it isn't now. The outlier case here is really interesting. So she was elected with the understanding that as soon as the First World War was done, she would give up the seat to the man who came back from the war. And she did. She served for 3 months. So that explains Georgia. God bless it. Okay. 1924, Seattle elects the first woman mayor. 1925, Wyoming elects the first woman governor. 1933, North Dakota elects the first woman Speaker of the House. 1933, Speaker of the House. Nancy Pelosi can't compete with that one. 1963. Actually, let me back up for a second. So think, all of these things happened in many cases before women had secured the vote nationally and through the temperance movement. And there's a lot of alignment actually with the temperance movement and progressive and populist politics and women being elected to office in the turn of the last century. And all of a sudden, there's a 30-year gap before you get any other firsts. And that is in Arizona, the first woman Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. 65, Hawaii elects the first woman of color to the House of Representatives. 84, Geraldine Ferraro is the first woman vice presidential running mate. 78, Kansas, first woman elected in her own right to the U.S. Senate. 1978 is really late. You know, there were women in the Senate before then, and between our friend from Georgia and Kansas, but most of them came in to fulfill their husband's terms after their husband died. There was a time where it was very safe to appoint the widow of the person who had been serving. And there's still some cases like that today, most notably Claire McCaskill, who's running in Missouri. But this was interesting as well because although she was elected in her own right, does anybody know who this was? Nancy Landon Cassavant.
Oh my.
And her father was Alf Landon, who ran against FDR. So she was in her own right, but probably found her name fairly valuable when she ran. 1981, Arizona put the first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. So Arizona gets to be a darker blue because they're extra special. 1987, Nebraska, actually this was a big year. Nebraska had a woman versus woman gubernatorial race, which was a very big thing at the time. And then they elected Nebraska, they elected the Republican. What a surprise. And she was the first Republican woman governor. Then in 2005, Washington was the first time that a state had a woman governor and 2 women in the U.S. Senate, and they still do. So Maria Cantwell, Patty Murray, and Christine Gregoire are still in those positions. And finally, Nancy makes an appearance in 2004, first woman Speaker of the U.S. House, 2007. 2008, New York has the first viable woman presidential candidate in Hillary Rodham Clinton. And in 2008, of course, Sarah Palin runs on the vice presidential ticket. So there's a couple of things I want to point out before kind of thinking about this map as a whole. One is New York's case, you know, if you remember, and the reason it's dark blue, they had 2 cases. One was Geraldine Ferraro as vice presidential candidate. The other was Hillary Rodham Clinton as the presidential candidate. So that's different than running in your state for these state positions, which was what most of them are. It's actually party politics and the party machine. And whether the party, whether you have enough control over the party or the party finds you useful enough to be able to move you forward. And that's actually one of the reasons the map looks like this, because women do better in states where there is less party control overall. So, which is different than Republican Democrat, right? So we're going to ignore Georgia because we know they were an outlier from the get-go. What else do you know here? What do you notice about this map? It's west, it's the frontier, it's the middle, that's what I heard. I mean, it's not just west of the Missouri or Mississippi, it's west of Missouri. So it is definitely the old frontier west. And this was actually what my research was about. How can these states, not how did they have the first women, but then later, are they still electing more women to office, even though they're conservative? That's a very long presentation, which I won't go into today, but they do still have some success in electing women to office. At one time, they were way ahead of the rest of the country. But what's interesting about it is that it doesn't align, and it didn't then, with Republican, Democrat, progressive, conservative. It had more to do with political culture and whether the rules were clear for women.